Venus was never a twin to Earth. It was a cosmic crime scene. By the year 2120, we didn't look at the morning star with wonder. We looked at it with a cold, calculated desperation. On Earth, we were losing the war against our own climate. Our ice caps were memories, and our cities were drowning. We didn't turn to Venus because we wanted to explore. We turned to Venus because we needed a planet B, and we were desperate enough to try the most violent engineering project in human history. Imagine a world where the air is so thick, it's basically a fluid, a crushing, toxic soup of carbon dioxide that would flatten a nuclear submarine like a soda can. At the surface, the temperature sits at a constant 460 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt lead, and it hasn't changed for millions of years. This wasn't just a hostile environment, it was a thermodynamic fortress. To break into it, we didn't need explorers. We needed to commit planetary-scale murder. We had to kill the sun. The Hera's Veil project was the ultimate expression of human arrogance. The logic was brutal. If you want to cool a furnace, you don't pour water on it, you cut the power. We didn't build a solid wall in space. Physics wouldn't allow it. Instead, we launched a swarm. Trillions of autonomous, ultra-thin solar sails made of aluminum-coated captain, each no thicker than a spider's silk. They were deployed at the Lagrange point Orcus L1, the gravitational sweet spot, where the pull of the sun and Venus cancel each other out. But where do you get the material for a shadow the size of a continent? You don't bring it from Earth. You strip mine the heavens. For 20 years, automated refineries chewed through the 16 Psyche asteroid, vomiting out endless streams of molten metal that were guided by magnetic rails across the void. It was a supply chain that spanned the solar system, a multi-trillion-dollar gamble funded by a coalition of desperate Western nations. The cost was so high that it sparked bread riots in London and water wars in the American Southwest. People were dying on Earth so that we could shade a dead rock millions of miles away. I was on the high reach observation deck the day the swarm reached critical mass. For the first time in 4 billion years, the constant scorching radiation hitting the Venusian atmosphere began to flicker. I watched through a filtered lens as the planet didn't just dim, it bruised. The brilliant gold faded into a sickly, necrotic purple. We were successfully suffocating a world. But as the telemetry started to pour in, the celebration in the control room died instantly. We had expected the cooling to be a slow, graceful process. We were wrong. By cutting off the sun, we hadn't just shaded the planet, we had broken its balance. The upper atmosphere, suddenly deprived of solar energy, began to collapse inward at supersonic speeds. A planet-wide shockwave was forming, and we realized that the long night we had created wouldn't be silent. It was going to be a scream that would shake the very foundations of the solar system. We had turned off the light, and now we were about to find out what was hiding in the dark. The darkness that fell over Venus was absolute. Without the sun's relentless bombardment, the thermodynamic engine of the planet didn't just stall, it imploded. For billions of years, the Venusian atmosphere had been a high-pressure cage of heat, but as the temperatures in the mesosphere plummeted, the very chemistry of the air began to rewrite itself. This was the beginning of the long night, a decades-long transition that would turn a hellscape into a cemetery of frozen gas. The first sign of the collapse was the rain. It did not start as water, but as concentrated sulfuric acid. As the upper cloud decks cooled, The sulfur dioxide reacted with trace water vapor, condensing into massive planet-wide storms. These weren't the rains of Earth. These were corrosive, searing downpours that vaporized before they could even touch the glowing rocks of the surface. For years, a violent cycle of acidic virga played out in the mid-atmosphere, rain falling, boiling, and rising again in a frantic, ghostly dance. But as the Hera's veil continued to block the light, the cold finally won. The temperature at the mountain peaks of Maxwell Montes dropped below the critical point. The atmosphere, composed of 96% carbon dioxide, began to reach its dew point. In the lower altitudes, the air grew thick, heavy, and translucent. Then, the impossible happened. It began to snow. This was not the soft, white snow of an Earth winter. It was dry ice snow, heavy, gray, and razor-sharp crystals of carbon dioxide falling from a bruised purple sky. The scale of this event is difficult for the human mind to grasp. Imagine a sky falling not in drops, but in trillions of tons of solid matter. Within a decade, the orange plains of Aphrodite Terra were buried under glaciers of frozen sea, 200s of meters thick. The immense atmospheric pressure, once a crushing weight of gas, was being converted into a silent, frozen ocean of dry ice. As the gas turned to solid, the surface pressure began to drop for the first time in an epoch. This triggered a geological nightmare. The Venusian crust, no longer held down by the weight of 92 atmospheres, began to heave. Volcanic calderas that had been dormant for millennia cracked open, spewing lava into the frozen carbon dioxide drifts. The result was a series of sublimation explosions, titanic bursts of gas that sent shockwaves circling the planet, tearing through the newly formed glaciers and creating canyons in seconds. Above this chaos, the first sky stations were established. These were not laboratories, but massive industrial refineries hanging from orbital tethers. Their mission was the Great Sequestration. Using giant solar-powered lasers and chemical scrubbers, they began the process of locking the carbon away. They weren't just clearing the air, they were mining a planet's worth of waste to create the building blocks of the future. By the end of the 30th year of darkness, the sun-scorched Venus was gone. In its place sat a world of white and gray, a silent, frozen ball of gas and rock. The furnace had been extinguished, but the cost was a world of total, lethal stillness. The planet was now a blank canvas, but beneath the ice, the core was still molten and the pressure was building. Humanity had managed to silence the morning star, but the real challenge was just beginning. How to wake a dead world without shattering it. The final phase of Project Hera's Veil was not about destruction, but about a surgical, cold-blooded resurrection. By the middle of the 22nd century, Venus had been successfully silenced. The atmospheric pressure had plummeted from a lethal 92 bars to a manageable 1.5, leaving behind a world of skeletal rock and vast, frozen oceans of carbon dioxide. The furnace was gone, but the planet was now a tomb. The challenge shifted from physics to chemistry. The carbon had to be removed, and the planet had to be forced to breathe. The solution was the carbon scouring. Massive orbital tethers, stretching thousands of kilometers from the veil down to the upper atmosphere, began to pump chemical catalysts into the remaining haze. At the same time, planet-wide swarms of self-replicating nanobots were deployed across the dry ice glaciers. Their task was singular and monumental, to tear the carbon atoms from the oxygen. They worked in silence, converting the frozen atmosphere into solid sheets of synthetic graphite and industrial-grade diamonds. Within decades, the once lethal air was being literally paved over the landscape, creating a black, shimmering crust that covered entire continents. With the carbon locked away in the ground, the remaining oxygen was finally free to bond with the hydrogen being imported in massive cometary trains from the outer solar system. For 10 years, the Venusian sky was filled with the streaks of artificial meteors, ice-rich asteroids steered by fusion engines to impact the cold plains. The heat of these impacts, carefully calculated to avoid re-triggering the greenhouse effect, melted the water ice and created the first true seas in billions of years. These were not the blue oceans of Earth, but dark, mineral-rich waters that settled into the lowlands of Atalanta Planitia. By the year 2190, the transformation was visually complete. Under the dim, filtered light of the Hera ring, Venus looked like a ghost of Earth. It was a world of dark, metallic soils, sapphire lakes, and genetically engineered lichen that could survive the thin, nitrogen-heavy air. But this Eden was entirely synthetic. The weather was a program. The tides were regulated by orbital stabilizers, and the very air was a product of a billion sensors working in unison. The legacy of the project remains the ultimate paradox of human history. Humanity had successfully conquered a planet, but in doing so, it had created a ward of the state. Venus became the most expensive life support system ever built. The Hera's veil was no longer just a sunshade. It became a permanent crown that required constant maintenance. If the swarm of solar sails were to lose power for even a few weeks, the delicate thermal balance would shatter, the carbon would sublimate, the oceans would boil, and the morning star would reclaim its throne of fire. As the first permanent settlements took root in the valleys of Ishtar Terra, a haunting realization settled over the engineers. They hadn't saved Venus. They had replaced a natural hell with a fragile, artificial heaven. The planet was no longer a wild entity of the cosmos, but a machine, a planetary-scale clockwork that served as a reminder of what humanity is capable of when it refuses to accept the limits of nature. We had turned the brightest light in the sky into a dark, obedient mirror of our own ambition. And now we were bound to it forever, the eternal guardians of a world that was only one technical failure away from returning to its original scorching truth.